But of course, the obvious question here is, what is this moral law that we're talking about? Well, in general, Kant thinks there are two kinds of laws. And so what he wants to do is to talk about the two different kinds of laws that there are, the types that there are, to generally identify what type of law the moral law would have to be if there were one. And then he's going to try to deduce the actual moral law just from the concepts of rational agency. It's quite a feat to behold, actually, whether you agree with it or not. So what follows is a multi-step argument, and we're going to go through it, hopefully quite cautiously, so you can see the various steps. So there are basically two kinds of imperatives. Now, an imperative is just a fancy way of talking about a command. So an imperative in particular is a command to act in accordance with some law. So you may have heard this expression. It's imperative that you be there. It means it's important in some sense, but that it's commanded. It's commanded, right? So we're going to be talking about imperatives and the kinds of imperatives that there are. And they get fancy names for Kant. So there's what he calls a hypothetical imperative, and there's what he calls a categorical imperative. A hypothetical imperative commands under the hypothesis that one wants something. So we can use some terminology at this point. The thing that you want is the end, and the way that you get that is the means. So here, hypothetical imperative has the form, if you want Y, then do X. And we can say that Y is the end and X is the means. Now, what is the point of this? Well, let's give a common sense example. So this doesn't make as much sense in an online class, but these slides weren't prepared for that, apparently. So if I told you you should not miss more than 5 of these classes, well, you might think, well, why shouldn't I miss more than 5 of these classes? Well, it's hypothetically, if you wanted to pass this class, then you would have some reason to obey this command. If not, then not. So if you don't care about passing the class, then this command has no effect on you. And sometimes I meet students like this. I say, here are the requirements. And then they don't meet those requirements, but they still come to the class because they're interested in the topic. They're less interested in passing it. They think they're going to have to take it again anyway, so this is good studying for them. It'll be good for them to get it or something like that. But so then they can miss as much class as they want if they don't care about passing it. Now, of course, hopefully you can sort of see to yourself, if you understand what a hypothetical command is, why Kant thinks that it can't be the kind of command that morality is interested in, because whether one obeys these commands depends only on the end that you happen to desire. So, for instance, if you say to one, if you want to be happy, then you must act virtuously or morally, as Aristotle was fond of saying. Well, someone who says, or at least thinks, that they don't desire happiness has no reason to care about morality. So you may say, look, if you want to be a good person, then you should care about telling the truth. But what are you supposed to say to the person who says, I don't give a crap about being a good person? Suppose they simply say, I'm not interested in being a good person. Being a good person is something that the chumps tell you. They're trying to make you into a sucker, you see. I don't want to be a good person. Well, someone who says that suddenly has no reason to obey the rules of morality if they're merely hypothetical. Excuse me. If morality is merely a hypothetical, based on hypothetical imperatives, then they have no reason to obey the rules of morality, or to put it slightly differently, they can opt out of the rules of morality whenever they want to. Right? Take the egoist version. If you want to maximize your own self-interest, then be honest. Well, that's fine, since in most cases you do want to maximize your own self-interest, and so that gives you plenty of good reason to act honestly. But of course the problem here is that you can equally well endorse the claim if you want to maximize your self-interest in cases when you can get away with it. Don't be honest. And you can think to yourself, that's perfectly consistent. So the only reason you have then to follow the rule, be honest, is if it maximizes your self-interest. And so you can opt out of it at any time if it doesn't maximize your self-interest. And Kant just thinks that the moral rules aren't like that. That they're not the kinds of things that you can choose to follow if it pleases you, or not to follow if it doesn't please you. He thinks they're of a completely different kind of nature, namely that they're categorical in nature. So a categorical imperative is one that binds unconditionally, right? So hypothetical imperatives are only matter to people who care about the ends that are postulated in the hypothetical situation. If you want this thing, then here's the way to get it. Categorical imperatives, on the other hand, have the form simply do this. Whether or not you want something is not at issue here. One just has to obey the command, and that's what categorical means here. It means that they should be followed without exception or without qualification. And Kant thinks that only categorical imperatives could capture the moral law. They're the only things that if there were a moral law which produced the duties that we have, the law would have to be something categorical in nature, because Kant views morality as laws which are akin to those of mathematics and which can't admit of exceptions based on things that you want. So, for instance, if it's a moral law, let me put this in the right way. If the moral law determines that we have a duty to be honest, then in all cases, honesty is required, even if we don't want to be honest, even if it's inconvenient for us to be honest, even if it produces harm for us, it's nonetheless required. And the reason that he thinks this is because he thinks that moral rules are categorical in nature. They don't admit of exceptions in exactly the same way as mathematical statements don't admit of exceptions. So if it's true that 2 plus 2 is 4, then it's true in all cases, even in cases where it's inconvenient for you. Imagine you only had $3 and you brought up 2 items, each of which were $2. Suppose the cashier rang that up and said, it's $4, please. $2 plus $2, cha-ching, $4. Suppose you said, oh, but I only have $3. That's terribly inconvenient for me. I want these things, and I don't have $4. So can't we just say that on this one occasion, 2 plus 2 is 3? That would be really convenient for me if we could do that. Well, of course, that's absurd, the cashier would respond. That's crazy talk. Who cares if it's inconvenient for you? 2 plus 2 is 4. You have this thing, it's $2. You have this thing, it's $2. So therefore it's $4. Either put one of these back or go away, silly person, but please don't ask me to change the fact that 2 plus 2 is 4. Well, the same thing is true for murdering, for instance. if the moral law determines that we have a duty not to murder, then it doesn't matter if murdering would be convenient for us or would help further our goals. If it's wrong, then it's wrong. The fact that it's convenient for you or inconvenient for you is, frankly, Kant thinks, irrelevant. So the moral law is binding, according to Kant, on all persons. It's just like the law of gravity, and just like you can't object as you're falling from a 14th floor window, wait, I don't like this, I don't want to be falling anymore. You can't object to that. You can't exempt yourself from the law of gravitation. Neither can you exempt yourself from the moral law, Kant thinks. Now, you may think it doesn't apply to you, but that, of course, is irrational, just like the person who thinks that the law of gravity or that mathematics don't apply to them is irrational. Kant thinks the moral law is there. It's universal in nature. Any rational being can verify for themselves that it's there and that it's true simply by reasoning in the appropriate way. Just like any person can sort of check for themselves that 2 plus 2 is 4 by reasoning about 2 and 4. I mean, basically, in shorthand, the process would be like this. How could it be anything besides 4? What would that even mean? Try to imagine a scenario where 2 plus 2 is not 4. You can't really imagine what that scenario would look like, how it would play out. So too, Kant thinks that if you're careful and you reason in the appropriate way, you can see certain things are required by morality that are necessary and universal and don't admit of exception. And now, what he's done so far is just to give an argument that if there were a moral law, it would have to be categorical in nature. That is, hypothetical imperatives are not interesting, they won't work, they depend on the inclination of the person. We've already done a lot of arguing trying to show that that's not good. We don't want moral rules to be the kinds of things that you can opt out of. We don't want it to be the case that we can say, yes, I know that generally speaking, torture is wrong, but I don't care about that right now. I need to torture this person in order to get the information that I need. Kant thinks that if torture is wrong, it's always wrong to torture, end of story. And there are no circumstances under which torture will become right. Okay, but we haven't yet done anything to say what the moral law is. We've just said, well, it will have to be of a form of a categorical imperative. Right? But what kind of imperative? What's the content? What does it command us to do? Well, Kant thinks that you've got to have something, the moral law, that is. There's got to be something which any rational creature could reflect on and see was something that required respect and that one should base one's actions on it. Now, a lot of people say things like, well, do unto others. That's sort of, if you reflect upon it, you would want people to treat you in certain ways, so you should treat them in certain ways. The basis for our moral views then should be that we want to be treated in certain ways, so therefore we're obliged to treat other people in certain ways. Now, of course, Kant thinks there's an important truth there. The golden rule is, of course, golden for a reason, but it doesn't capture all the truths about morality. And the book points out a couple of interesting ways that Kant thinks it doesn't capture all the rules of morality. For instance, duties to oneself. We'll talk more about that later. But here we can just note that it doesn't capture what seems intuitively right and what we ought to say to a person who doesn't share our basic views. So imagine again the uncaring person. They just don't care about other people. You say to them, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this person thinks, well, I would have others do unto me this way. Leave me alone. Stay out of my business. Don't help me and I won't help you. Just piss off. Thank you very much. Now, of course, this person will then have a completely solid seeming justification for not helping other people or caring about the welfare of other people. So too, a person may think, do unto others. Well, I don't really care if people tell me the truth about stuff. Who cares? So I don't care if I wouldn't want someone to tell me I look fat in my jeans, so I'm going to not tell them they look fat in their jeans. And I wouldn't want someone to hurt my feelings by telling me they had cheated on me, so I'm not going to tell you I cheated on you, etc. Well, these clearly seem ridiculous. So do unto others is not the kind of law which we can reflect on and then come to respect, because we see, well, sure, it's a good rule of thumb for people who already have the right kinds of inclinations. But what about the rest of them? It doesn't tell us what's the nature or what the reason for these morally valuable actions attaining that status, because it certainly can't simply be that I feel a certain way about them, because as we've seen ad nauseum, people feel all kinds of ways about these things. So what are we supposed to do then? Well, still, there's something about do unto others which is right, Kant thinks. Namely, it has you think about the way actions can be consistent or inconsistent. So he says, look, what we want here is some kind of general law. A law which, if a rational person reflected on it and really understood what it meant, they would say, aha, that's right. That's the kind of thing which in all these circumstances could produce an overwhelming feeling of awe and respect in the person who fully came to truly understand its nature. And do unto others doesn't do that. Now, it also has to be the kind of law which doesn't make reference to any particular character traits, since those can be good or bad depending on whether one is subject to the moral law. So we can't include those in the content of the moral law. It can't say, thou ought to be honest, thou ought to be brave. It's got to be something completely general, which we can use to generate our specific duties. And the only thing that can really command the respect of a rational person, Kant thinks, is the concept of a universally binding moral law. So it's only when you kind of go, oh, see, the moral law has to be something which every person could accept, has to be something which rational persons are really impressed by, something that they recognize just by reasoning that it's valuable and commands that you do these actions. Well, what kind of thing could do that? Well, a universally binding moral rule, a moral law. Well, let's formulate it this way then, Kant says. This is something that has to do with actions, but no particular actions, only the concept of action. So we don't include a particular action there, but only the command that one ought so to act in such a way that one's actions could be done by all persons without contradiction. Or a bit more formally, act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal moral law. Now, you may not fully understand what that means, but Kant thinks if you reflect on it, then you'll see that this is the kind of rule which every person ought to obey, namely that their actions should be non-contradictory, non-self-contradictory. And the reasoning is really by analogy to the way we think about logic. So if you think about certain forms of reasoning in logic, For instance, if you think about the general pattern of reasoning, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal, which is exemplified symbolically by the form in syllogistic logic. All A's are B, S is an A, therefore S is a B. Now, if you just sort of reason about that form, you can see, well, anything you put in the place of A and B and S there, you're going to get something which is true and something which is truth preserving. Something which, if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. All dogs are mammals. Frankie is a dog, so Frankie is a mammal, right? You can see, you can do this all day long, filling in the various A's, B's, and S's, and you're going to get something which you can go, yes, when I'm reasoning, I should follow this rule. This produces good patterns. Now, you can't give an argument for that. You just sort of have to reflect on it and see that, yes, it avoids contradiction. That's what's guiding me here. And in something like that, the categorical imperative, Kant thinks, when you reflect on it, on the rule, one sees that non-contradiction is guiding one's reasoning process here. And what one is doing then is thinking, look, if my proposed course of action were suddenly to become a law, like the law of physics or the laws of logic, everyone had to do this without choice, what would be the case? Would there be a contradiction in such a case? If there is a contradiction, then the action is immoral.